She's a writer, musician. She led worship. She's leading worship. She was actually at IHOP's One Thing internship a few years ago, which I completely forgot about. She studied comparative literature at Stanford. She got a BA there, and then she went to Harvard Law School. But she's not going to be a lawyer after all that, right? Maybe. So, but she's going to write, and she's going to share more tonight. And the space that her and her husband is in and pursuing is amazing. It's from the world that our kingdom world of faith, intellectualism, spanning that difference, and really encouraging that growth. Beyond just faith itself, but acknowledging the truth that surrounds us. And I love that world that they're in. And they were a part of a study in LA funded by the Amundsen Foundation, right? Was it the foundation or the family? The family itself, and you guys know the Amundsen family is one of the most influential families. And it was a study on culture and faith in LA, mapping that out, kind of. I'm totally butchering it. But so it is such an honor to have her here. And I mean, my goodness, Jamie I'm still stuck with her gutter reference right now, but I'm excited to have Christina here, so let's welcome her. And
Thank you, guys. First of all, I just want to say, wow, that was so good, Jamie. I didn't get to meet you before, but thank you for sharing all that you did. That was very wise and very courageous, and I totally resonate with you. I actually almost did a talk on the same topic, and I decided not to, and I feel like our topics actually align somewhat, because I love that you talked about like 100 years from now, where are we going to be? And that's, me and my husband, that's what we think about all the time. We're always thinking about culture and how the church engages and interacts with culture, and we're always trying to think like not just 5 to 10 years, but 50 to 100 years from now, like what is it going to be? And so I feel like you touched on one aspect that's very dear to my heart, which is male-female relationships, and I just totally agree with everything you said. So yes, another round of applause for Jamie. Yes, so good, so good. So tonight I'm going to talk about I'm going to talk about something similar, but I'm going to talk about it from a more like a 30,000-foot perspective. So this touches like many different fields and many different topics, and it's how cultures change. Very descriptive title. But yeah, I just wanted to tell you a little bit about myself. I'm from Southern California, born and raised in Orange County. My parents were immigrants from Taiwan. They came to the U.S. in their 20s for grad school. They both have PhDs, very smart and hardworking, and then moved to Southern California, and that's where I was born and raised. And I have a younger sister whom you'll see soon in a photo. And then I went to Stanford for undergrad, studied comparative literature. I did a minor in creative writing. So at Stanford, we had this, fuzzies and techies. Did they say that when you were there? Yeah. Like, are you a fuzzy or are you a techie? And I'm like full fuzzy. Like, I can't do math. I can't barely do science. Like, technology is, my frenemy. And I'm all about the humanities. And so a lot of what I'll be talking about in my talk today is like very humanities driven. So that's kind of where I come from. After college, during college is when I found out about the International House of Prayer, IHOP. Somebody gave me Misty Edwards' Relentless album, and my friend was like, if you like, because I was a songwriter, she was like, if you like songwriting and worship, you'll love this. And I put it on, and my life just changed. I was like, I've never heard anybody sing about Jesus in this way before. I didn't even know it was possible to know him this way. And I immediately was like, wherever she comes from, I need to find that and go there. And then I was like, 24/7 worship and prayer. This is just like in the Old Testaments with the Levites. We're just in the house of the Lord all the time. I always wanted to be a Levite. And so I was like, I graduated from Stanford. I was like, Mom and Dad, I'm going to IHOP. I'm going to live the rest of my days in the house of the Lord. And my parents, they had been to IHOP before and they had loved it. They had great experience. But as soon as I said that, they were like, no, you will not, like, not my daughter. And we had a rough patch with many tears and prayers. And eventually we compromised and I did a 6-month internship. And it was amazing. It totally changed my life. Those 6 months were some of the most formative months of my life that still continue to affect me and shape who I am today. And I'm so, so grateful. So Kansas City has a really special place in my heart. And it's an honor to be invited here to come and speak. After I went to IHOP, I felt invited by the Lord to apply to law school. So I applied to a few different schools, and I only got in to Harvard. So I went to Harvard. It was just pretty clear that that's where God wanted me to go. And I met my husband there. My husband, Christian, he began his architecture master's during my final year of Harvard. So we overlapped for a year, dated. I went off to DC because I already had a job there. I worked in big law for about 2 years, and then we got married. I came back to Boston. I clerked for a judge for a year, and then our lives changed dramatically, and I don't have time to get into it tonight, but maybe tomorrow or in conversation later. We've had a crazy past few years, but during that time, we have really gotten the chance to do some deep dives into studying culture and kind of how it works and how it's been shaped and changed throughout history. And something that I am super passionate about is what are the opportunities for the church to engage in a meaningful way. So that's a little bit about me. And tomorrow we'll talk about the book project that we did. That's kind of what took me out of law. Okay, so with that, now that you know me a little bit better, let's talk. Okay, so ever since childhood, here I am. There I am. There's me and my little sister Elizabeth. She's 5 years younger. Ever since childhood, I have wanted to change the world. I don't know if it's just my personality, I just want to be in control of everything, but I've always just wanted to have an impact, a big impact on the world. And specifically, I've wanted to see Jesus' kingdom come to earth, on earth as it is in heaven. Like, I just wanted to be a part of that. In early high school is when I got connected to the more charismatic, spirit-filled stream of the church, and I started going learning about moves of the Holy Spirit, learning about revival, encounters with God, miracles, and I started going to a lot of gatherings and conferences where we would just pray for revival. And I was just sold immediately, I started showing up to school early in high school. As many of my friends as I could gather, I would be like, okay, let's go. We're gonna go to Mr. Emery's classroom, and we're gonna pray for revival to come to Northwood High School. And we would go every morning. We'd go to my English teacher's house and classroom, and just put our heads on the desks and just pray for revival. And sometimes we would prayer walk the campus, and sometimes during lunch, we would just bust out the guitar and start singing worship songs. And I would just imagine, like, okay, what is it gonna look like when revival comes? People are just gonna run out of the classrooms and fall on their knees and just weep and repent, and people will be healed. Like, no one will have to take ADD medication anymore. Did you guys have friends that always had to leave during class to take their ADD medication? I was like, everybody will be healed. And I wanted to see revival so badly. Number one, because I wanted to see the power of God. I mean, who doesn't want to see those things, right? But number two, I've always been a very justice-oriented and compassionate person. And there's so much pain and devastation in the world. Choose your topic, right? Like poverty, sickness, war, sexual abuse, school to prison pipeline. Like, if you try to think about it all, it's completely overwhelming. But I just always thought, like the answer to this is just if revival were to come, like if millions and billions were touched by God's love, like everything would change, And back in the early 2000s, remember, I'm from Orange County. Does everybody know what Saddleback Church is? It's like this huge mega church, Rick Warren. So my parents were going to that church for a while, and they launched this initiative called the Peace Plan. And the purpose was basically to mobilize churches all over the world to combat like the global giants of poverty and, war and hunger. And I signed up right away to host a training group at my house, my parents' house. I was 16. I was like, okay, this is it. Like, this is the answer. We mobilize Christians all over the world, and then like, that's how we solve the problems of the world, like, because that's how societies will massively shift for the better. If only it were that simple. If only that was how societies actually change. We just, what's that Leland song, which I love and I think it's great, but like, one man wakes, awakens another, next to a brother, run it down, turn the whole place upside down. Which is true, and it's awesome, but the type of large-scale societal change that I had in my mind, I grew to learn is not exact. It doesn't exactly work that way. And this really started to sink in when I was in law school studying, the legal system, and I was particularly interested in the criminal justice system. I studied it and I worked in it a little bit as a law student. And then afterwards, of course, I graduated and I was working at a big corporate law firm in DC, right across from Capitol Hill. So in law school, I started learning about just systems. And, it turns out societies are comprised of systems, which are upheld by culture and simultaneously feed into culture. And here's my analogy. It's like, as in a human body. By the way, I cut off the bottom part of that slide on the left because there were some graphic drawings that I did not want to include in this holy gathering. I'm just kidding. The human body is beautiful and good, but let's just focus on these. But as in a human body, right, you have all these different organs, you have all these different systems, and then you have the blood that runs through the entire body. And it's a very dynamic and complex relationship. Like, the organs affect the blood affects the organs. There's some organs that you can live without, like your kidney. You can remove a kidney, right, and you can still be okay. But if you removed your whole liver, you would not be okay. So it's a very complex and dynamic relationship. And it's what I started to realize studying systems is that it's not just changing individual hearts and minds that you need in order to change a society. You need to change culture and systems. And those things are not easily changed. And I don't think I'm telling you perhaps anything that you don't know, but just for fun, let's look at some examples. Okay, so here's my first example. Here's a system, right? The system of traffic laws, okay? If one day I am like, no, I don't think this system is right, I am gonna start running through all the red lights, I'm gonna stop at the greens, and I'm gonna drive backwards because this is the change that I've decided to make. I will probably get into an accident or jail very quickly. And even if I were to mobilize 1,000 drivers or 10,000 or 100,000 drivers, which good luck with that because, people don't really have an incentive to do things like that. But even if I were to find 100,000 other people to do all this crazy driving, I wouldn't really change the system of traffic laws. We would probably make the news, we would probably make it onto TV, but we wouldn't really bring about any kind of lasting change just by changing those people's minds. Because systems are larger and they're more resilient than the individuals inside the system. That's why we have systems, so that we don't have to reinvent the wheel every single day. We kind of set something up and then eventually it begins to run itself. That's what an effective system is. Okay, next example, the criminal justice system. When I was in law school, I worked at Harvard's Criminal Justice Institute, which we represented indigent clients facing misdemeanor and felony charges in Boston criminal courts, which is a fancy way of saying I was a student public defender. So if there were defendants who they couldn't afford to pay for a lawyer, they would get assigned to us, students. Hooray for them. Yeah, I mean, we were good, but we definitely did not know a lot of stuff. And actually the reason why I decided to go into the defense clinic is because I actually wanted to become a prosecutor. That's just more of my personality. I'm like, put them in jail, punish them. That is my leaning. But I wanted to see how the other side lives. I wanted to, experience what it's like to be in the defense world. And so I joined the defense clinic. And during my time there, I saw firsthand how unjust the criminal justice system can be, especially towards the poor. Okay, so just as some examples, we had clients who were drug addicts, who were homeless and had mental health issues, and they would just keep on getting arrested and then let back out and then arrested and let back out, and just building up these criminal records that would then just make it harder for them to find jobs and get services. And it was just like this machine, churning and churning. And I just remember one of my colleagues had a client who was a homeless woman who was schizophrenic, and he heard voices that would tell her to go steal nail polish from the CVS. And so and this CVS knew who she was, and she would go and steal this nail polish, and they would just call the police. And then, and this was her life, and she wasn't getting the help that she needed because this system was just so efficiently, cycling her in and out. And it just made it so even more difficult for these people to get into a pattern where they could actually start to heal. And they were capable of healing, by the way. I had two clients who were both heroin addicts. There was a man in his 50s and a woman in her late 20s. And I got to see them both achieve sobriety through grace and a lot of hard work and determination. I'm in awe of them, that they were able to do this. But I also saw they could have probably done so sooner had they not gotten caught up in this criminal justice hamster wheel. And meanwhile, I mean, we've all seen this, right? I don't even need to name any names, but we've all seen so many examples of people with the money to hire a good lawyer who, they are so guilty. They're so guilty, but they get off scot-free because we have, and this is not because most, police officers and lawyers and judges are wicked, unjust people who discriminate against the poor. It's not because of the individuals. It's because we have a system that advantages the rich and disadvantages the poor, right? So systems are important, okay? One more example to fit our theme of women in leadership. So when I was working in big law, that's kind of our term for big law firm. Big law, very creative. So from time to time, my firm would host these women's events, and they were meant to show we value female associates, female leadership, female empowerment. And I don't doubt that their hearts were in the right place. But over and over, the only message to us female lawyers seemed to be, if you want to succeed, act more like a man. So, okay. We had a discussion one day, happy hour book club, with all the female associates and partners about this book called Lean In by Sheryl Sandberg. So if you don't know, Sheryl Sandberg is the COO of Facebook. And she wrote this book, and there's a lot of good stuff in this book. But kind of her main argument is that women shouldn't be afraid to be more ambitious, more opinionated, stronger, speak up more, go for positions that you might not even be qualified for, because those are the things that men tend to do in, these high power workplaces, and women tend not to do these things, okay? So that's why she's lean in, do it, grab a seat at the table. And at the end of the discussion, I raised my hand and I was so is there anything inherently valuable about being a woman in this law firm context? Is there any advantage that we have just by being women? And there was just silence. And finally, one, female partner raised her hand and was well, we know how to not be jerks. And I was like, cool. But here's the question that nobody asked. Why were all of these smart, talented women being told to change themselves in order to be successful? Well, the answer, yes. The answer is that the system of big law, along with a lot of other, corporations in general, it was not built with women in mind. This is not my opinion, this is just fact, right? Like when the seeds for what is now corporate America were being sown, like only men were allowed to work. Only white men were allowed to work, right? This goes all the way back to Great Britain. And there were certain ideas amongst this small group of people about work, about performance, about productivity, that are still reflected in the system of corporate America today. So in big law, for example, you are rewarded for working nonstop, canceling dinner plans and vacations, not sleeping, showing up in the nick of time to your own wedding. This actually happened to a friend of mine. And if you don't do these things on a regular basis, you will not get promoted. In fact, you will eventually be phased out. Okay, because big law is a system that tends to value profit over rest, relationships, and just health in general. Firms may say otherwise, they all say otherwise, like work-life balance is so good here. But their policies and their systems of rewards and punishments speak louder than their websites. This type of work culture, I want to emphasize, is unhealthy for men and women. Okay, I think it's unsustainable. I don't think it's God's best for us. But it's especially hard on women, many of whom want to be mothers, right? If you have a system that makes it very difficult to be a mother, you're going to have a hard time retaining women, and no amount of advising women to act more like men is going to solve that problem. Furthermore, I would say that by encouraging everyone to be more aggressive, be more competitive, be more prone to over-exaggerate your skills and qualifications, because that's what successful men do, you are encouraging a more toxic work environment, not a healthier one, okay? I don't want to be with all those people. So what needs to change wasn't the women, it was the system. Midway through my first year at that law firm, I had a dream. And in my dream, I was standing on a beach watching these big waves roll in, and there was a huge machine rising up out of the water. And it was all these giant wheels and cogs and gears, like turning. And all over this machine were people. They were working on it. They were like building it and fixing it and maintaining it. But all the while they were working on it, the machine was still going, and as it moved, people's bodies would get caught in the gears and crushed. And at the bottom of the machine was a person standing beneath the machine, getting drenched in the blood of all the people that were getting killed. Yeah. When I woke up from the dream, I knew immediately what it was about. It was about this system in which I found myself at the time, the system of not only big law, but far too many other corporations in the world today. It is a machine that claims the lives of many, and I don't mean it literally kills people, but I do believe that it kills a lot of people's spirits. And it claims many lives in the process of enriching a few. And here's where this all ties back into how societies change, how cultures change, right? I realized while working at this firm that even if everybody in my firm became an on-fire believer overnight, they would still have to get up the next morning and come back to work in the same system, in the same machine that keeps grinding and grinding regardless of who's getting caught in the gears, because you come into it as a young lawyer and you're taught these norms, and that is your normal, and you don't really know how to think outside of it, and you don't really have the power. When you're operating inside of a system like this one, the most that you can do as a believer is you can resist being changed by it, which is very powerful and very important. Okay, and you can save some lives being in these systems, in these structures. You can do some really good and powerful things, but you cannot change the system, and neither can the boss, by the way, because the system is much bigger than just one company or one firm. Christians sometimes focus on like famous, powerful individuals like celebrities and politicians. And they're like, if we could just get Beyonce on fire for Jesus, you know, or if we could just get more Christians in Congress, like then the kingdom would come, like then God could really move. But what we don't realize is that you don't get to be Beyonce or in Congress by resisting the system of the music industry or politics. You get there by playing according to the rules better than anyone else. Like you get there by winning, gaming the system. And you know, in case you didn't know, I hope this doesn't, you know, this is not meant to come across as like hating, but politics and the music industry are not centered on the worship of Jesus. They're centered on the worship of power and mammon. And so the minute like a top celebrity or politician is like, you know what, I don't want to play by any of those rules anymore, they're just going to get replaced by somebody else.
So is Hollywood. Hollywood's the same way.
Yeah, amen. I agree. So, you know, going through all these experiences, thinking about all these things, really convinced me that if we want to see the type of change we hope that a revival would bring, we have to start thinking differently. We have to start thinking about systems. How are they formed over time? How are they maintained? How do they change? And we can't just strategize about how to get into the systems or even to the top of the systems. We actually have to start thinking about how to reimagine them. And we have to prioritize that above getting into power and gaining influence and being in charge, because like I said, by the time you get to a place of power within a system, you've probably lost the ability to reimagine it. Like the system is now inside of you. A few weeks after my dream about the machine, my husband, Christian, got a picture for me while he was praying. He saw that same machine, but this time it was in a field and it wasn't moving anymore. It was stopped. And in the picture, I walked up to it and started taking it apart and handing pieces of it to other people. And when I would hand them a piece, it would turn into a flower. How do you stop a people-killing machine from killing people? You take apart the machine and you create something life-giving. If we want to see the type of change we hope for a revival to bring, we need to start investing in the people who are reimagining systems. About 4 years ago, I read this book that confirmed and elaborated on things that I was already discovering about systems and cultures and how they change. It's called, aptly, To Change the World by James Davison Hunter. Has anybody heard of this guy, James Hunter? I highly recommend this book. It's really, really good. So James Hunter is a believer. He's a professor of religion, culture, and social theory at the University of Virginia. He's also the executive director of the Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture. And in his book, Hunter argues that the historical evangelical approach to cultural change, which was focusing on changing hearts and minds of the general population, he argues that that doesn't actually work, which I think we have established, right? But he backs this up with historical data. He goes way back, and he takes the reader through times in history where culture actually did massively change, okay? So like the Christianization of the Roman Empire, the Reformation, the Enlightenment. He talks about those times, and then times where culture seemed like it was changing, but it didn't have that long-lasting effect, as in Prohibition or the rise of the religious right. So here's how Hunter articulates the realization I came to about revival and cultural change, okay? Imagine a genuine third great awakening occurring in America where half the population is converted to a deep Christian faith, but without a fundamental restructuring of the institutions of culture formation and transmission in our society, the market, government-sponsored cultural institutions, education, advertising, entertainment, publishing, the news media, not to mention church, revival would have a negligible long-term effect on the reconstitution of culture. Okay, at this point you might be thinking, yeah, I know about this. This is like Seven Mountains framework, right? So not exactly. In many ways, here you go, handy dandy, Seven Mountains. So in many ways, this framework and others like it share similarities to Hunter's theory of cultural change. They both emphasize the importance of looking at systems. They both argue that revival alone is not enough to change a society in any meaningful way. But there are a few areas in which these theories diverge, and so I want to address that. So first of all, the Seven Mountains framework often, not always, but often enough, uses war analogies, okay? So you see invading Babylon, mandate to invade the Seven Mountains, reclaiming the Seven Mountains. I've heard, conquering, taking it. So the philosophy there is that, like, right now, the wrong people are in control of most of the mountains of society, and the solution is for Christians to take control of those mountains instead, okay? So the problem that I see with this is that culture is not a war to be won, okay? So remember my body analogy? There we go. Culture is living and dynamic. It's highly complex. It's formed over time by a diverse network of circumstances and actors. And Hunter lays this out really, really well in his book. You can't force a culture to change by fighting it, okay? In recent years, I think that, we've seen a lot of what some would call progress that Christians have been making in taking the Seven Mountains in the governmental sphere, right? So fighting and campaigning to get conservative candidates in office, like that's where a war analogy can work when it's like a political battle, right? But the political sphere actually exerts very little influence over the cultural imagination. Okay, so here's an excerpt from Hunter's book that addresses this. Okay, so he says, imagine further several social reform movements surrounding, say, education reform and family policy becoming very well organized and funded. And on top of this, serious Christians being voted into every major office and appointed to a majority of judgeships. Legislation may be passed, judicial rulings may be properly handed down, but legal and political victories will be short-lived or Pyrrhic without the broad-based legitimacy that makes the alternative seem unthinkable, okay? I remember back in law school, I did this legal fellowship, and anti-abortion activist came and spoke, and she said something that I've always remembered. She said, my goal is not to make abortion illegal. My goal is to make it unthinkable. And I was like, wow, yes. Okay. Such is the story, what he just described, all these people getting elected, such is the story of one of the most powerful transatlantic social reform movements of the 19th and early 20th centuries, the temperance movement, okay? This movement failed, not least because it did not and could not address the culture of restraint on which the particular interests of temperance depended. In the end, the ideal of temperance finally expired in derision with the repeal of the Volstead Act in 1933, the word having now disappeared from our public vocabulary. This same logic accounts for the contemporary failure of the Christian right to stop the growth and legitimacy of homosexuality, abortion, and pornography, among other concerns. The passion and earnest resolve generated by all such movements may change people and may affect communities, and they may for a time change laws, but they generally will not influence the course and direction of the culture as a whole unless they are tied to larger structural changes in the culture. So it turns out winning over the governmental mountain is not the key to changing culture as a whole. Let's take a look at one of the times when culture did shift significantly, okay? The Reformation. Look at these guys. Aw, they're so serious. But they were reforming, okay? They had to be serious. So this is a long, complicated story, so I'm gonna try to tell a short version without butchering it. So during the Reformation, okay, you had intellectuals and theologians like Martin Luther and John Calvin, yes, but they were only a small part of a very wide network of theologians, professors, and students operating through universities and academies that were associated with each other, partnering with each other, okay? All of these people were extremely well educated. Luther and Calvin, very well versed in the classics, from Aristotle to Seneca, Augustine to Peter Lombard. They were highly respected and well-connected intellectuals. So they were already set up for their ideas to be taken seriously. they also had support from the humanist movement, which humanism back then is not what it means today. Has anybody heard of Erasmus? Erasmus, he was like one of the leading, most famous humanists of the day. Most of the humanists were still Christians, but it was really this shift from like thinking about humans as just, groups rather than individuals. So among other things, the humanist movement was one of the first intellectual movements to start pointing out hypocrisies within the Catholic Church, and they would do this through satire. And this is what like kind of softened the ground for the Reformed theologians to come in and start critiquing it even more sharply and heavily. By the time Luther and his colleagues started, putting out their writing and, putting their 95 theses on the door, more people ready to take them seriously, okay? So because of all these networks, Reformed theology spread quickly throughout universities and academies, many of which happened to be located in urban areas that were growing in power because international commerce was expanding. So a lot of different moving parts here, okay? These urban networks, these university-based networks became catalysts for innovation, for the sharing of ideas, for the establishment of new universities and churches all over Europe. And Luther's critiques coincided with discontent that had been fomenting against the Catholic Church for a long time. He and his colleagues articulated an alternative culture that resonated within the existing culture and its institutions. Okay, that's what led to leaders in other sectors of society, like businessmen, nobles, to accept Reformed theology. Some of whom because they genuinely believed in it, others of whom because they saw that like this new alternative culture would benefit them. Less power for the Catholic Church meant more power for them, right? So there's a lot of stuff happening there, but those nobles are the ones who protected Luther from getting killed by Catholic leaders. Many people were trying to kill him, and he had protection from powerful people. So all of these factors working together are what led to the creation of what we now have, Protestantism, right? And if you look at the other historical movements that I mentioned, the Christianization of the Roman Empire, the Enlightenment, you generally see the same patterns playing out, okay? And this is how Hunter describes it. Deep-rooted cultural change tends to begin with those whose work is most conceptual and invisible, and it moves through to those whose work is most concrete and visible. So he goes on to say, in a very crude formation, the process begins with theorists who generate ideas and knowledge. Then it moves to researchers who explore, revise, expand, and validate those ideas. Then it moves to teachers and educators who pass those ideas on to others. Then it passes on to popularizers who simplify the ideas, and then practitioners who apply those ideas, okay? Then he says, as to politics, where present, it contributes most effectively to the process of cultural change, not when it imposes a cultural agenda, but when it creates space for a new way of thinking and living to develop and flourish. Okay, so, political action can help nurture cultural shift that's already taking place, but it's not the initiator of such change. It's actually pretty far down the line. So how does culture change? Hunter says cultural change is the most enduring when it penetrates the structure of our imagination, of our frameworks of knowledge and discussion, of our perception of everyday reality, right? I don't just want to make it illegal, I want to make it unthinkable. Okay, how are we doing? I know I just read you so many quotes, so many historical facts, and it's 9:17. Okay, good. Good, all right. So who are these people? Who are the people whose work penetrates the structure of our imagination, frameworks of knowledge and discussion, perception of everyday reality? Writers, theorists, academics, artists, leading scientists, a lot of people whose name you may have never heard, okay? So I just pulled up the 2021 MacArthur Fellows, okay? People who are winning MacArthur Genius Grants, Pulitzer Prizes, Nobel Prizes. I mean, have you heard of these people? I haven't. They're not celebrities, right? But they're music critics, writers and radio producers, physician economists. What is that? Computational virologist. Wow. Poet, lawyer, painter, poet, another poet, translator, biological physicist. And I just put these two ladies up because I love their work. Louise Erdrich, she just won the Pulitzer Prize in Fiction, and Caroline Shaw won the Pulitzer Prize for Music in 2013. And people who are being published in Nature magazine. This is one of my old classmates, Frank. Now he goes by Guosong. He has the kind of beard-ish in the middle. That's his lab. Stanford built a lab for him, and he's a believer. Super awesome. Getting published in Nature magazine, showing art at the Venice Biennale, right? These are the people whose work is going to penetrate the structure of our imagination. We just don't really know their names, because by the time their work gets to us, it's already gone through so many different people. But they're the ones that pioneered it, okay? Back in, over the summer of 2020, you started hearing this phrase a lot, defund the police, right? And for many of us, it was like the first time we're like, what does that mean? That was from books that were being written 10, 15, 20 years ago, okay? Those theorists were thinking about these things, and it took that long to kind of trickle into the mainstream and go all over Instagram and become viral, right? What we're seeing now with like the trans movement and, ridding the world of the gender binary, all that stuff, that was pioneered by people like Judith Butler way back in the day, in the 80s, okay? So these are the people. These are the people whose ideas are going to penetrate the structure of our imagination. And so if our attitude as Christians is like this warlike, antagonistic one of like, those, people who are ruining our country, there's no way we can form meaningful relationships with people like this, who are shaping culture, much less take over their mountain. I'm not gonna be able to take over this guy's mountain. He's so smart. Okay? So true societal change requires working together with different Imagineers, cultural Imagineers, to borrow a word from Walt Disney, okay? Cultural Imagineers. They're engineering and imagining culture, stuff that isn't there yet. Building respect and mutuality with them, not trying to usurp their power. And so here's another reason why I want to challenge that, you can call it Seven Mountains, you can call it whatever, right? It's people inside and outside of the church that kind of think this way about cultural change. But it focuses on simply just replacing the leaders on each mountain instead of reimagining the systems themselves, right? And, okay, I already said that. I'm not trying to pick on Seven Mountains, okay? It's the one that, you hear a lot about in church when people talk about changing culture. But we need to reimagine, not just replace. I don't believe you're gonna rid the world of sexism by taking every male leader and changing it to a female leader. Because sexism is built into a lot of our systems, and there's a lot of females that are sexist, right? Like, a lot of times I didn't like working with the female partners at my firm because they were like twice as mean as the male partners because they had this, chip on their shoulder where they felt like they had to be twice as aggressive, whatever, right? So that's not what's gonna change things in the way that we wanna see. And this is something that we really need to think carefully about, because I think that in our tech-driven society, it does feel natural to see everything through this lens of like, let's program a better life for ourselves by like plugging in different variables to like the same equation. And I'm arguing for something a lot more holistic than that, a lot more uncomfortable, a lot more invasive. Like, this is not a minimally invasive surgery, it's a maximally invasive. But, nor am I saying, let's take a knife to culture and chop it open and take out the organs. I'm saying that we need to start right now, before, this long-awaited revival comes. We need to start right now investing into the people that are doing this reimagining, okay? How do you stop a people-killing machine from killing people? You don't fill it with better people. You have to take apart the machine and create something better. So I'm not here today to tell you what the blueprints are for these new systems, okay? Unfortunately, the next few slides do not contain, the solutions to reimagining culture. I know, I'm sorry. Give me like 2 more years and I will figure it all out. Just kidding. The whole point of Hunter's analysis is that no one reimagines culture on their own, okay? In every generation, there are theorists, academics, theologians, scientists, writers, artists, all these different people who are doing just that. But in order to be effective, they need to be working in networks with each other. And they need to be receiving enough support, institutional and financial support. So I believe that if we as Christians want to help change the world, we need to build bridges with and invest into cultural Imagineers, okay? We need to help create and support networks of people with the expertise and the anointing to reimagine culture. But I don't think the church is doing it as well as it could be at the moment, okay? And I see two kind of big reasons why. First of all, sometimes Christians can be fearful or disdainful of cultural Imagineers, okay? I'm going to show you this picture, and this photograph is called Piss Christ, okay? It's not a very, it's called Piss Christ. It's not a very nice sounding name, okay? It's by this artist, Andres Serrano, okay? And this is a photo, it's a photograph of a plastic crucifix in a vat of liquid that is comprised of blood, cow's blood, and the artist's own urine. Okay, so this made some Christians very angry when it came out, okay? There were two senators at the time, Jesse Helms and Alphonse D'Amato. They said it was a deplorable, despicable display of vulgarity. They used it as an example of why the government should defund the National Endowment of the Arts, okay? But here's what the artist had to say about the photo, okay? Said the thing about the crucifix itself is that we treat it almost like a fashion accessory. When you see it, you're not horrified by it at all. But what it represents is the crucifixion of a man. Christ was crucified and laid on the cross, where he not only bled to death, you can read that part by yourself. You know, there were other bodily fluids involved as he died. And so if Piss Christ upsets you, maybe it's a good thing to think about what happened on the cross. Wow. You know, according to the artist, this was not meant to be a blasphemous piece of art. It was meant to disturb. It was meant to challenge. But it actually wasn't meant to blaspheme. And tomorrow we'll talk a little bit about the art project that we did in Los Angeles. We spent a year researching the contemporary visual art world of LA and its relationship to faith and spirituality. And we wrote a book on it. And we saw a lot of examples of artists that kind of had these like bombastic pieces that Christians would be like, oh, what? No. You must hate God. You must hate Christians. But when we actually interviewed those artists, it was nothing of the sort. They were very fascinated. They had some really weird ideas sometimes. But they were trying to work through these ideas. They were trying to kind of push these cultural norms, right? And many of us are immediately offended by art like this. Because we're taught to be skeptical of challenging and unconventional ideas. And so we sometimes too hastily label people as blasphemers or deceived or demon-possessed when they are simply doing the thing that they were created to do, which is challenge, imagine alternative cultures. Are they sometimes blasphemous and deceived and demon-possessed? Yes, okay? But so are some Christians, okay? So if we don't develop the discernment to know when someone is demon-possessed and when they're actually pointing out uncomfortable truths, then we won't be able to effectively invest in the ideas of cultural Imagineers, okay? The second reason I think the church hasn't done a great job of investing in cultural Imagineers is that we misidentify them. Okay, I kind of touched on this before. We tend to focus on the famous, powerful people, okay? We want to be friends with celebrities, best-selling authors, really rich, billionaires, because we think that these are the movers and shakers of culture. However, as we've seen from history, these people in the spotlight, they tend to be the ones that are actually riding the wave of culture. They are proliferating it. They are indeed making big changes sometimes, but they are not the ones that are driving it forward the most. Honestly, not even Elon Musk, okay? Not even Jeff Bezos. They're not at the forefront of reimagining it, okay? Hunter's pithy description of cultural Imagineers is that they are networks of elites on the peripheries of power. This is important. They're not usually in the center, because usually people in the center don't come up with the alternative cultures. They're already benefiting too much from the existing culture, okay? So cultural Imagineers, they're not, by no means are they on the fringes of culture. They are on the peripheries of the center, okay? They have connections with cultural centers, whether literary or academic or governmental or business, and that's why their ideas can end up gaining traction instead of just disappearing. So if Christians want to be engaged in culture, those are the people that we need to be learning about. Those are the people we need to be building bridges with and investing into. Okay, what does this look like on a practical level? So one example is, does this building look familiar to anybody? It's here in Kansas City. Yeah. Does anybody know what it is?
It was the old drugstore.
Uh-huh.
But they turned it into an art thing.
Yeah.
Church grabbed it and turned it into an art incubator.
Yes, yes. Okay, so my friend Dylan Mortimer, yeah, I mean, gosh, round of applause, star student. So yeah, my friend Dylan Mortimer helped run this church, or not this church, this old drugstore that was bought by a church. And from 2012 to 2019, they opened it up to local artists. And if you were an artist, you could apply to have your studio space in there for a nominal fee. And Dylan made it so that it was kind of the top artists that would self-select into this place. And then when they got there, many of them never would have stepped foot in a church on their own. But when they got there and learned that it was a church that was providing this space for them for a nominal fee, and a church that was choosing, I think, 2 artists a year to give grants to say like, hey, take this money, do some art with it, they began saying like, hey, can we like get to meet these people? Can we build a relationship with these people? Like, I feel like we should know them. And word spread throughout the artist community in Kansas City that one of the main patrons of the art world in Kansas City was a church. Wow. How cool is that? Wow. Yeah. Unfortunately, it is no longer being used as an art space because I think, transition of leadership, and I think it's really hard for a lot of Christians to like fully grasp how vital and important that was, that it was being used to artists. And churches face so many tough decisions that they have to make, so it's not a knock on them. It was eventually sold to someone else, but I think perhaps had they truly grasped the type of cultural capital that they were tapping into by investing into these young people who are not famous yet, but these are the people, like this now is the time, right? To nurture them, to help them, to build a relationship with them. They might have tried hard to keep the building. But churches have to make tough decisions all the time. So I understand. But while this lasted, it was a prime example of the church nurturing cultural Imagineers. And I believe even for those 7 years, it had a really big impact. So in my life, here's some pictures of the artists in that space. Really cool. So in me and my husband's own life, what it looks like to invest in cultural Imagineers has been our ministry that we started called Estuaries. Estuaries exists to build community for and incubate ideas for Christians who are reimagining culture. And we do this by creating spaces in person and online that are equal parts spirit-led and intellectually vibrant. Loved being at IHOP, loved being at YWAM, learned so much from being at Stanford and Harvard, but those worlds were so separate from each other. They did not touch each other, and you need those to be in the same place. And so we decided, okay, we're going to create a place like this. We value diversity, which is why our first inaugural 10-day seminar in Kona brought together YWAMers, IHOPers, students from universities like Harvard and MIT. It brought together people from a wide range of racial and socioeconomic backgrounds. We raised enough money to provide full scholarships to anybody who couldn't afford to fly there or pay the cost of being there. As well as disciplinary backgrounds, okay? So in our group, we had architects, we had lawyers, theologians, psychologists, professors, engineers, chefs, farmers, computer scientists. We invited all of these people into a space where they could bring their whole selves, where they didn't have to leave their intellect at the door. They didn't have to lay aside their hunger for encounters with God that confound the intellect. They didn't need to hide their questions about, the trustworthiness of scripture or racial injustice or Christian sexuality or quantum physics. They could discuss these questions in the presence of some really smart, talented, capable, spirit-filled believers. Just to share a little bit, in this space, people were healed and delivered and set free. One of our participants, a grad student in architecture from Harvard, She was freed of a generational stronghold that had been causing her to see demonic visions, like constantly while she was in school. Another participant publicly repented for using his intellect as a way to hide his insecurity. Another participant's spine was healed. And the next year, that participant was our scholar in residence. We provided a scholarship for him to come out to Kona at Estuaries and work on his PhD dissertation for Harvard. So every morning before he started work, a group of us would lay hands on him and prophesy over him and pray for him, and then he would go work on his dissertation. And when he turned in his draft at the end of the summer, his advisor said, "This is one of the best dissertations I've seen in 20 years." So our participants left Estuaries with, new hope for their role in the body of Christ. There's been a lot of turmoil happening in the church, hasn't there, in recent years? A lot of fallout, a lot of people leaving, and a lot of these people kind of felt like, hey, I don't know if I really have a place in the church anymore. And they left feeling like, yes, I do. I am the church. They've formed lasting friendships and partnerships. They've worked on creative projects together, academic projects together. And our goal with Estuaries is to keep supporting these people and others like them, to continue connecting them to one another, forming those networks. And in the future, we would love to do things like offer grants to them and say like, hey, you have this idea to study the link between spiritual realities and mental health, and you're a psychology PhD, like here's some money to go do that study, because it's gonna be hard for you to find that money elsewhere, okay? Or you are an environmentalist, you're working to address climate change through the wisdom and love and hope of Christ. Yes, we wanna support that. Here's a grant to do what you need to do. So, I'm almost done, guys. 2 more minutes. You guys are doing so well. So here's my question for you. What does it look like for you to build bridges with cultural Imagineers? What does it look like for you to invest in them? It's gonna look different for each one of us. The last thing that I'm gonna say is I wanna be clear, I'm not advocating for the church to try to reverse engineer culture change. The truth is, as I hope I've described, culture is a lot more complicated than that. And the ways in which it changes, many of those ways are completely outside of our control. For example, this pandemic, okay? We are right now living in the midst of a major cultural shift, the results of which we won't fully understand until 50 or 100 years later. There are cultural vacuums that opened up years ago that are now gaping holes, okay? Gender, sexuality, the whole Me Too, remember the Me Too movement, right? So what do we do about sexual assault? Race, how do we live in a democracy without killing each other, right? There's gaping holes in culture right now. And as much as I wish that we Christians could just grab the reins and steer the world into a better place single-handedly, I know that we can't, and that's not what we're supposed to do, because that's not what Jesus did. He didn't wrest control away from the world. And that's not even how our Old Testament kind of influencer heroes, right? Joseph, Daniel, Esther, those are influencer heroes, right? But they didn't scheme to get into positions of power. Sometimes I hear about people using those 3 names, and it's that's why we need to be the most excellent for God so that we can be in Pharaoh's ear. And it's he wasn't trying to be in Pharaoh's ear. All 3 of those people were brought into those places through force and through suffering, okay? But when they found themselves in those positions, they realized that God had been preparing them their whole lives for such a time as this. So our goal is not to find ways to get our people into positions of power. Our goal is to help our people reimagine systems so that if and when God sees fit to move them into those cultural vacuums, they actually have something better to offer, right? You're saying, eye has not seen, ear has not heard. It doesn't exist yet. We need to birth those things, and we need to invest in the people who are called and anointed to birth them. Okay, something better to offer beyond painting John 3:16 on a people-killing machine. Something capable of stopping that machine, taking it apart, and building something life-giving instead. All right. Wow. Thank you guys for your attention.